Now that we've gotten our eyes on promises, we can see the most practical use of them inside of ES6, which is with the fetch helper. The fetch helper is a new feature that is, just like promises, implemented inside of your browser already. So this is not a bit of new syntax. This is a new keyword that is available, or excuse me, a new object that is available in your browser already. So right at the command line, I can just enter in fetch, and it returns a function for me that says specifically, hey, native code here. In other words, this is something that is a part of the browser, and you don't really get to see the internal workings of it too much. So we can use this fetch function right here to make Ajax requests across the internet and fetch resources that are available to us. Let's see how it works in practice. There we go, practice. Okay. So the first thing that we do whenever we make a fetch request or a request with fetch is we decide what URL we want to make a request to. So just for our purposes right here, I'm going to declare a URL ahead of time. And we're going to make a request of a very particular URL. I'm going to post it in right here. So we're going to https JSON placeholder dot type or tip code, I don't know, there's no E in there, so watch that, .com/posts. So this is the URL that we're going to be using. One thing I want to point out in particular is that the domain is HTTPS. I am specifically pointing to HTTPS right here because the address that I'm on at JS Playgrounds is HTTPS right now as well. Okay, so to make a Ajax request with fetch, we call fetch and we just pass in the URL. That's it. That's all there is. I'm going to copy and paste this over. And as you can see, we get back a promise from fetch, and it is existing in the pending state to start. So a promise, whenever we create it, or a request, excuse me, whenever we create the request, remember this is a long-running process. This is something where we have to reach out to the internet, wait for something to happen, and then only after we get a response back, if it is successful, the promise is going to enter the resolve state, and then we could register a .then helper to get access to the data. So let's register a .then helper. Whenever this promise gets called, it will be called, or excuse me, resolved with some amount of data. So let's just console log it and see what we get back. I'm going to copy this, paste it, and we get back some thing right here that represents our request. Notice some of the properties that are on here. These are properties that are common to all different requests that you're ever going to make using the fetch helper. We're always going to have body used, headers, OK, status text, type, and URL. You'll notice though that it appears that I don't really see any property on here that contains the JSON or the data really that came back from this endpoint here. So this is one of two very big complaints that I have about the fetch API. Whenever you make a request, the response that you immediately get back here does not immediately actually contain your data. This is not our data right here. This is an object that represents the response that we got back from the server. To actually get access to the data, we have to call a method on it. So I'm going to delete everything in here, and let's see what we have to do. I'm going to take a argument that I'm going to call response, and I'm going to call a response.json. So what this method does right here is it takes the request that we just got back, or the response that we just got back from the server, and it pulls some actual readable JSON data out of the response that we got back. Again, we're doing this because whenever we get that response back from the fetch, it doesn't actually contain our data here. To get access to the data we actually care about, we have to call .json. And so if this seems like a little bit backwards, a little bit weird, yes, I absolutely agree with you, it absolutely is. Only after calling that JSON can we actually get access to the data that we want. So now I will console log data, and I will copy paste this in, and now you can see I get back a list of objects, which is the actual data from that endpoint that we just made a request to. So they are a list of posts is what they're supposed to be, and each post has a body, an ID, and a title. So that's how we work with fetch on a very practical level. We call fetch, we pass in the URL, and then we call response.json, and then we can actually get used to or get access to our data. So there's one other big complaint that I have about fetch that I want to talk about in the next section. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm not the biggest fan of fetch. I really highly recommend that you still use Ajax utility libraries like, say, Axios or SuperAgent or even jQuery if you have to. But anyways, let's continue in the next section. I want to show you the other big complaint I have about fetch that's very important for you to know as well.